What happens when just two words on live television can shake an entire nation? Not because of politics, not because of breaking news, but because of something much deeper. This isn't about a debate or a headline. This is about dignity, respect, and what happens when one person decides to stand tall when the whole world is watching. It was a regular Tuesday night. Millions of people were watching, expecting another round of heated arguments and sharp-tongued comebacks. The show was popular, the kind of thing you half-watch while scrolling through your phone. But nobody was. Ready for what came next? On one side of the table sat Karoline Leavitt. Sharp words were her brand. She knew how to make a crowd cheer or laugh by cutting people down. Across from her sat Captain Traoré, the young leader of BurkinaFaso.com. Clear, not there to fight, just there to speak. This wasn't supposed to be a battle. Producers wanted a quiet talk about foreign policy. But live TV doesn't always follow the script. What happened next wasn't planned, and it all started with two words that would echo across the world. The lights were bright, the cameras steady, and everything looked like it was going to be just another political debate. The kind of show people leave on in the background while they cook dinner or scroll through their phones. The studio was busy but controlled. Everyone was doing their job, expecting nothing more than the usual talking points. Sitting in the guest chair, Captain Traoré was steady. Calm, his voice was even, his words chosen carefully. He wasn't there to stir trouble. He wasn't there to throw blame. He was simply telling the truth as he saw it, about African independence, about his people, and about the long, painful road that countries like his have walked. No anger, no drama, just steady truth delivered with quiet respect. Across from him sat Karoline Leavitt. If you knew anything about her, you knew she was good at one thing: making noise. She had built her career by cutting down guests on live TV. Her style was sharp, fast, and often cruel. Clips of her takedowns filled social media with people either cheering or shaking their heads. And tonight, millions of people were watching, expecting her to do what she always did: dominate the conversation. But something about tonight was different. It wasn't because Captain Traoré was difficult to deal with. He was actually the opposite. He was patient, focused, the kind of person who could sit calmly while the world shouted around him. And that calmness was starting to annoy Karoline. You could see it in the way she kept shifting in her chair, the way her lips tightened whenever he answered with clarity. She wanted him to snap, to stumble. But he didn't, and that's what made it worse. As Traoré carefully explained the impact of Western involvement in African economies, Karoline started rolling her eyes. At first, it was subtle, just a quick glance to the side, a little shake of her head, but then she started getting bold, interrupting him, throwing out questions that weren't really questions at all. They were traps, loaded words designed to push him off balance. Still, he stayed calm. He answered with grace. He didn't play her game, but Karoline wasn't about to walk away empty-handed. That's when it happened. She leaned forward, sharp, like a snake about to strike. She raised her hand slightly, pointed right at him, and said the two words that would change her life forever. "Sit down, boy." It was like someone cut the air out of the room. You could hear the hum of the studio lights. The host's jaw, literally, dropped open. The people sitting in the front row sat completely still, eyes wide, not sure if they actually heard what they thought they did. And at home, across the country, people gasped out loud. Phones buzzed instantly. Social media feeds started lighting up. Did she just say that? No way. She didn't just say that on national TV. For a second, nobody moved. All eyes were on Captain Traoré. Would he explode? Would he shout back? Would he walk off the set and leave her sitting there with that smug look on her face? But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he just sat there, completely still, calm, solid, almost like the insult didn't even touch him. But it did. It touched something deeper than anyone on that set could see. And that's what made the silence even louder. His stillness wasn't weakness. It was control. It was strength. It was the kind of power you don't often see on television, the kind that doesn't come from volume but from dignity. Then something unexpected started. Happening in the front row of the audience, an elderly black woman slowly raised her hand to her mouth. Tears were already rolling down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because of shock. She was crying because she knew. She knew what those words meant. She had heard them before, maybe not in that studio, but in schools, on buses, at work, in moments meant to remind people of where society tries to keep them. She could feel what Captain Traoré was feeling, not because of the insult itself, but because of the weight behind it. And then there was the man sitting just behind her, a U.S. military veteran. Older, gray hair, a sharp uniform jacket neatly folded over his lap, his posture shifted slightly forward. His hand rested gently over his heart. He didn't need to say anything yet. You could tell by his eyes that he understood something the rest of the room hadn't quite caught up to yet. Respect was growing. The tide was starting to turn, but Karoline didn't notice. Karoline, meanwhile, sat back in her chair with a slight smirk, thinking she had one, thinking she had landed the final blow. But what she didn't realize was that this wasn't the kind of fight she thought it was. This wasn't about who could shout the loudest or who could trend the fastest. This was about truth. And truth doesn't play by TV rules. The cameras stayed locked on Captain Traoré's face, and the longer they held on him, the more powerful that silence became. Every second without a reaction made the insult look smaller and smaller. Karoline thought she had taken control of the moment, but really, she had handed it over to him. Without even knowing it, the internet was already working. Clips were being cut, hashtags were starting to spread, memes were already being made. Some people were angry, some were in disbelief, but most were simply stunned. Not by Karoline's words, but by Traoré's reaction to them. Silence was louder than any headline that night, and while the world held its breath, something much bigger was about to break open, because Captain Traoré wasn't going to sit down. He wasn't going to shout back either. He was going to do something none of them saw coming, and what he said next would make history. The room stayed quiet, but the kind of quiet where you can feel something building. Captain Traoré sat still for just a second longer, then slowly stood up. Not angry, not shaking, just steady. His eyes scanned the room, not looking for sympathy, not asking for help, just ready to speak. And when he finally did, his voice wasn't loud. It was soft, steady, and strong enough to make the whole room lean forward to hear him. "I come from a place," he began, "where boys are forced to become men before they learn to dream." Right there, everything changed. This wasn't a debate anymore. This wasn't two people arguing on television. This was someone opening his life on national TV, showing every scar he carried. And the more he spoke, the quieter the room got. He talked about his childhood, how he studied by candlelight, because the electricity never came back after colonial powers left. He talked about missing meals, about watching his friends starve while pretending he wasn't hungry himself. Then came the worst part. He told them about the day he buried his father. There were no cameras there, no speeches, just dirt, silence, and the sound of his mother crying. This wasn't just his story anymore. You could see it in the faces of the people watching. Something deeper was happening. An older man, a U.S. military veteran sitting on the panel, sat up straighter and pressed, his hand over his heart. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but his eyes were starting to shine. He had seen real pain during his years in the military, but hearing Captain Traoré speak reminded him of something bigger, something about service, sacrifice, and the things we carry that no one else can see. And then came the moment that broke the room wide open. Captain Traoré slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded, worn letter. It looked like it had been opened and closed 100 times. The edges were soft, almost falling apart. "This," he said quietly, holding the letter with steady hands, "was written by my younger brother 2 days before he was killed during a protest. He was fighting for food." The whole studio froze. The veteran's hand on his chest trembled. The cameras zoomed in, catching every small movement of the creased paper as Traoré unfolded it. "Big brother," he read, "if I die, promise me they won't forget why." No one moved, no one blinked. Even the loud hum of electronics seemed to disappear. This wasn't about TV ratings anymore. It wasn't about party politics or national pride. It was about something raw and human, grief, loss, and a love for people most viewers had never even thought about before this moment. And then, breaking the stillness, came a small voice. A young girl sitting in the front row whispered to her father, just loud enough for a microphone to catch it, "He sounds like you, Daddy." That was it. That was the moment. Everything shifted. More people in the crowd began to wipe their eyes. Even the host was frozen, his mouth slightly open, not knowing what to say next. On social media, something was already happening. The hashtag #SitDownBoy was trending, but not the way Karoline had hoped. People were flipping it, turning it into a badge of strength, not shame. Clips of Traoré's words were being shared, with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." But Karoline couldn't stand it. You could see the panic behind her eyes as she realized she was no longer running the show. She leaned toward her microphone and tried to pull the attention back to herself. "Oh, come on," she snapped, her voice sharp and thin. "Are we seriously going to pretend he's some kind of saint now?" The words landed like a bad joke at a funeral. People in the audience actually flinched. Even the other panelists didn't back her up. And then the veteran spoke. His voice was low, but there was steel behind it. "That's not debate," he said, pointing directly at Karoline. "That's humiliation, and it dishonors every brave man and woman I served with." Karoline's face flushed red, her mouth moving, but no words coming out. She wasn't used to being called out, especially not by someone with medals on his chest and tears in his eyes. The veteran's words hit harder than any insult she could throw back. And just when you thought the emotion couldn't get any stronger, the screens behind the stage lit up. There on the screen was a little girl, the same one Traore had mentioned. Earlier, from his visit to a hospital in Chicago, she was holding a handmade flag with the colors of Burkina Faso mixed with the American flag, waving it proudly with a smile that could light up the whole room. "Hi, Captain," she said, her voice sweet but strong. "You remembered me." Even the camera crew couldn't hold it together. You could hear sniffles behind the scenes. Grown men in the audience were openly crying. The host wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket, trying to keep his voice steady as he whispered into his microphone, "My daughter's the same age." But the little girl wasn't done. "You said I was brave," she said softly, "but tonight you were the bravest." At that moment, something shifted, not just in the studio, but across homes all over the country. This wasn't just a television show anymore. This was a moment people were going to remember for the rest of their lives. This wasn't about who was right or wrong in a debate. This was about humanity standing taller than pride or politics. And then she said it, the line that would be played over and over again in the hours, days, and months that followed. "Next time someone says, 'Sit down, boy,' I'll tell them to stand up like Captain Traoré, there at once." The insult, once meant to humiliate, had been flipped on its head. It wasn't a curse anymore, it was a challenge, a call, a movement. The insult was buried, not by anger, not by shouting, but by something bigger than any headline could hold: truth, dignity, and the unstoppable power of standing tall in the face of hate. By the time the show ended, the world outside, that studio, was already on fire. Not with anger, but with something else. People weren't just sharing clips, they were pausing dinner, stopping mid-sentence, calling friends to say, "You need to watch this right now." On social media, the hashtags weren't just trending, they were spreading. One comment stood out among the thousands pouring in, "My father cried watching this," said it reminded him of 1963. Another read, "I showed this to my students. Half the class couldn't stop crying." Inside the studio, the producers were frozen. Phones were buzzing, emails were stacking up, news outlets were already fighting for exclusive interviews. No one expected this kind of reaction, not from a quiet political talk show on a weeknight, not from a story that, just an hour before, felt small and far away to most Americans. And then something even more unexpected happened. A few days later, Karoline Leavitt came back to that very same studio, not with makeup, not with cameras rolling, but alone. No press, no noise. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to deliver a letter, a folded piece of paper, creased. Like someone had opened and closed it too many times, just like Captain Traoré's brother's letter, but this time it was Karoline's words inside. The producer handed it to Captain Traoré during a press conference the next day. The room went quiet again, just like it had the night of the show. And when Traoré opened the note, he read it carefully, then lifted his eyes and spoke softly. She wrote, he said, "I said, 'Sit down, boy,' and you stood taller than I've ever seen a man stand. I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. I hope we both grow from this." It wasn't loud. It wasn't for applause. It was for something better change. In that same studio, something small but powerful was done that no one explained, but everyone noticed. One chair, the very chair where Captain Traoré had sat, was left empty. No one used it anymore. No one moved it. No one spoke about it on the air. But every time someone passed by it, they knew what it meant. It meant that sometimes silence speaks louder than the loudest argument. It meant dignity under fire. And that empty chair became a quiet symbol of what had happened that night, a reminder that no insult could erase truth. Soon after, the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis reached out. They were preparing a permanent exhibition. They wanted to call it Dignity Under Fire, and they asked Captain Traoré if his words could be part of it. He agreed, but not for himself. Not for me, he said, for all of them. Then came the moment that tied everything together. Captain Traoré stood on a world stage at the United Nations, holding something small but full of meaning. It wasn't a flag made by professionals. It was that handmade drawing from the little girl in Chicago, the flag she had held up on the screen that night. He raised it gently before the cameras. This flag, he said, was given to me by a child who believed that two nations, hers and mine, could stand together. That means more to me than any medal or speech. And then he added something that would stay with the world long after the headlines faded. America don't just clap. Change. That was the heart of it. That's what made this more than a viral moment. This wasn't about watching something powerful and then going back to regular life. This was about why we listen, why we stand up when we're told to sit down, and why true change doesn't start with applause, it starts with courage. He closed his speech with the kind of truth that doesn't need decoration. We don't heal through silence. We heal through courage. And here's where I'll leave you, not with just a story, but with a question. Which part of this moment hit you the hardest? Was it the brother's letter? The little girl's words? The empty chair? I want to know. Drop a comment below. Here, we don't just tell stories to fill time. We tell stories that change how we see each